which meant priest. Cohen means to serve or a servant. Cohen. A rabbi is a legal teacher or a leader. When Jesus looked at the guy, and the guy come to him, and he says, and they called him what? They called him rabbi. We know that you are a teacher. The thing is that Jesus was not a teacher. He was a Cohen. Because he told him. He says, I did not come here to what?
I did not come here
Be served. He says, I came here as a Cohen. Something that's interesting about a Cohen was a person of the Levitical tribe, and it was passed down from father to son. It was a generational blessing that was passed down. When Jesus identified as a Cohen by saying, I did not come here to be served. The rabbis, they are teachers. They are somebody who went to school. They are certified to teach. They have credentials that says they can teach. They are leaders. A priest is different. A priest, typical leadership, a royal priesthood, when you think about it in terms of, if you ever read like any kind of fiction book, I mean not fiction, but like a fantasy book or a science fiction, and it shows the role of the church. Oftentimes, and especially if you go and you look in the Middle Ages, the role of the church, and especially if you start reading Fox's Book of Martyrs, you will find that all these people that were attacked, all these people that were tortured, that was punished and all this, was all done by the church. It was all done by the church leadership. The church behind the king was basically in charge. The whole Knights Templar thing, it was because, again, the church was behind it. If you read your history, you'll find the role of the church. The church at one time was the authority. The story in the Fox's Book of Martyrs, it tells the story about this one guy. He had got on a ferry to cross the river, and this was over in Europe. And so what happened to him, he was sitting there, and this guy walks over to him, and he stands there. And he goes, excuse me. And he said, yes. He says, do you not know who I am? And the guy's like, no. He says, well, I'm so-and-so, so-and-so. And basically, he says, I want your seat. The guy says, I'm not giving you my seat. He says, yes, you will. When they got off on the other side, the guy had the people come in that served the church, and they seized this guy. And they took him before an inquisition. And this is one of the guys, one of the tortures that they had this huge metal plate. And first thing that they did, they locked him in this little cubicle, little bitty old square cubicle. And after they let him go through there, then they pulled him out, and believe it or not, they heated up this skillet thing, and they put him on there and fried him. Because he would not give his place to the priest. History is, especially Fox's Book of Martyrs, you'll see all these people who were killed by the church ruling parties. So the thing is that it had to do with this concept right here. That the priests were in charge. The priests were rulers. The Cohens are a very interesting thing because they were of the tribe of Israel. They were the Levites. If you ask a question about Levites, what separated the Levites from all the other tribes? What did they not have? An inheritance. They did not get land. Land was a title. Land, if you were a landowner, you had a title. You were from this place. I find it really interesting the difference between the levels of the Cohens. There are your general priest, and then there are the high priest. One of the differences is is that the general priest every 30 days had to get a haircut. Every 30 days they had to get their hair all cut off. You ever seen priests, and you know why that they're bald? You ever seen priests that their hair was shaved and all that? Yeah, if you'll look, you'll start seeing, especially like some of the Asian people, you'll start seeing Kung Fu. When you see David Carradine, he had his head shaved. You know why? Because hair, the word hair, now I can do research for it, but the word hair has to do with gateway. And the gateway was when your hair started, so I like Axton. One of the things that they talk about now is this generation of kids' hairdo. And it was talking, I see this little meme the other day, and it's talking about how what looks like, and so there was this big old, this deer, and it says, this is what this younger generation of hair looks like. So David, he had his head down in the brush and stuff, and he raised up, and it was everywhere. Then they showed this picture of this kid standing there with a guitar, and his hair was everywhere. Hair, when your hair starts growing, it starts identifying who you are. We start having hairstyles. When Axton was the other day at Silver Dollar City, he was like, what do you think, Papa? Does this look good? Because he knew he was going to get his picture taken. So he wanted his hair, he's experimenting with hairstyles to get his perfect hairstyle. Because it was his identity. A priest, a Cohen, has no identity. When the priest's hair would start growing out, it would start forming his identity. A high priest, once a week, had to shave his head. Once a week. Because within that month, your hair can grow out. You can start forming an identity. What happens is that as this high priest, you have zero identity. Now, if you think about this thing, with a priest in ours is that one put over another. That is what the Latin language says. But all of a sudden, we find out this Cohen means, it says not meant to lord over another, but to connect others to the Lord. So in other words, the Jewish version of a priest is a servant. A servant. Now if we take this phrase that you are a royal servant, what does that mean? That means you are held to a higher standard. That meant that you represent the king. All your actions, all your deeds, all the things that you do. Think about this thing. When you send somebody, I was telling Amber about this and I was bragging about Jacob. I got 2 letters the other day about Jacob. Well, not letters. I got 2 texts about something Jacob did. One lady says, hey, I don't know what this done and I don't know what y'all are paying these guys, but I'm going to tell you right now, it's not enough. Because here it is at 7:30 at night. These boys are still out there working. And he says, they're leaving nothing behind. Daddy, you know how proud I was at that moment? Because who do they represent? Me. They represent the company. One lady is so funny because she had sent me a text. She says, well, Monty, is it possible that you can clean out my grapes? And the thing is, I said, now look, they're there today. They're going to get them taken care of. Well, they went down there and she sent me a text. She said, Monty, thank you for him coming down there. She said, matter of fact, I gave him a little bit of money. And she says, if it wasn't enough, let me know, because he did, not only did he just clean it out, but he washed it out. That is a servant's attitude. That is a servant, because your actions represent somebody else. When we start taking it into consideration that as a Cohen, as a royal priesthood, we serve the king. The royal priesthood, now we have to break down what a priest does. We connect others to the Lord. And I didn't really understand the real significance of that until this morning. Because when I was talking to this young guy and he was riding with me, Lance, one of the first things he did, he told me, he says, now I'm going to tell you, he says, and I don't even know how he knew that I was a preacher, but he says, I'm going to tell you right now, he says, I don't believe in God. He says, I'm not going to church. You can't convince me that church is right, that I should go to church. He says, I'm not going to believe in it. He said, so no matter what you tell me, it ain't going to work. I said, cool. I said, I don't have a problem with that. I said, because it's not my job to preach to you. But it is my job to say this. You cannot let a human being affect your relationship to God. Because if you're judging God by his humans, God ain't his humans. God has expectations of us. God has requirements of us. I said, but the thing is, I said, when you start looking at God and say, I don't want to go to church because this is how Christians are. I don't want to talk about God because this is how Christians are. I said, you've got this thing all wrong. I said, God ain't Christians. And oftentimes Christians are not God. They don't even reflect God. Sometimes Christians are the worst example. Those who pronounce themselves as this, as that. So that's why I was telling you from the very beginning, we have to change how we view ourselves. In other words, if we took it that everything that we did reflected the face of God. Okay? Somebody is constantly watching us. What if Monty acts this way? How many people if I act a stupid, Dory, am I leading to God? You're not, are you? When we start considering how our actions, how our words, because we are to connect others. The thing is that being a royal priesthood means, if you're a royal priesthood, that means that you have the ears of the king. He has got you there for a reason. Now you've got to understand this. A priest role is to hear from the people and turn and give it to God. That is a priest role. He's to serve you. He's to watch over you and say, okay, now AJ's getting in problems or AJ's having this problem. He's going to turn and he's going to say, hey, God, as a royal priesthood, he is a person who is spiritually attuned and he's looking for the needs of the people, the spiritual needs of the people. So what happens is, and then when he says, hey, king, there's a person here doing this wrong. He's causing these troubles, or these people are being oppressed. So he turns to the king and says, hey, king, we got a problem. There's people doing this and hurting these other people. He stands in the gap for the weakest people. Does that make sense? And so since he has the ears of the king, he can take what he sees and turn and give it to the king. That way the king, because the priest does not have any authority. Who has the authority to do it? The ruler, the king. So when we take it from that perspective, now what we're doing is called standing in the gap. Oftentimes we want to fix other people. We want to fix other people. We want to be these ones that drop these words, that do these changes. We have to let God do them. Does that make sense? Because every time that I try to fix something, what happens? I'm going to mess it up. But man, when I let God fix it, and I let God take over and let God be in charge, I let God be the king. But it's my job to talk to the king. I have got the access to the king. This person, like this young boy, does he have access to God? Yes, he does. But because of his attitude and how he's been done, he's formed this opinion of what God is. It is my job to help break down his walls. And the first thing that I could do for him was to let him know that what was done to him and what has happened in his life was not God. Does that make sense?
Of course not.
It wasn't God. It was people.
That's right.
Now that you understand that you are the face of God, you should be that kind of person that as a royal priesthood, people knows that they can come to you and they can petition because they can't go to the king. They don't have access to the king. We have. And I love in Exodus 19, it talks about, and he says, my will basically is that I have a whole nation of priests. My whole kingdom is priest. So what he was saying, God says, I want a whole kingdom of servants.
That's right.
But it's something else, and there's another point of this thing with a Cohen that I find really, really interesting, and it tells you the layout of God's expectations. I told you from the very beginning that a Cohen was passed down, correct? From father to son. There's an image that I was reading about, and it was talking about how the Jews trained up their children. Now, when you start realizing what it means to train up your children, it showed the image of a priest. Now, the priest, they handled the special ritualistic services. They handled the altar. They handled the sacrifices. They handled the holy instruments. And as this man, it showed this picture, Danny, of this man. He was in the temple. He was close to the sanctuary. And as he was putting he was doing his stuff down at the altar and all that, his son was right there watching him. I took Axon with me the other day, and Axon got to work. I knew Axon didn't know anything, but yet I wanted to teach him what work was like. Why is that important? I told Axon, I said, Axon, you probably will never work with your body. Axon will be one of them mind people. But the problem with society is society forgets what it feels like to work. Lance, you have a good understanding now of the difference between work muscle and play muscle, don't you? It's not the same, are they? Two different, distinct things. But when you work for a living and you see somebody else, I remember when I was an estimator at Landers, and I watched them. They were setting up Simon forms around a big old monolithic slab they're going to pour. And they had big, tall Simon forms. And what they did was, and I've told y'all the story, they didn't compact the footings good enough and get them poured before the inspector could see them. Now, mind you, they had 4-foot Simon forms all the way around it. Simon forms, these big old forms that they had set up around it. Well, what did the inspector do? The inspector climbed over them, Danny, and he got to the other side, and he has this little rod, and he goes, That meant that they didn't compact it, because if you don't compact it, and if you don't get solid, Lance, when you pour concrete and put a building over it, what happens? It settles, and it cracks. So what they had to do, they had to go back in, and they had to shovel all that stuff out, because they done set the forms all the way around this big, huge building. They ain't going to tear that stuff down. They had them people, Danny, in there with shovels, shoveling this stuff out, because you couldn't get a backhoe in there. You can't get nothing. They're in there shoveling the whole perimeter of this thing out, and then packing everything. I sat there the whole time at my desk. And Jacob, I looked outside and I went, man, I'm glad that's not me. Because I've done that job. If you've ever run a whacker packer all day long, God almighty, all day long.
Except for body workouts, for sure.
It's everything. And it wears you out, and I watched them guys do it. And see, I can understand because I have done that job. When you've worked, and so that's what I wanted Axton to understand. When you've worked for a living and you're dealing with, and you don't work for a living anymore, always have respect for somebody who works for a living. Because when the society loses respect for the people who work for a living, society gets turned upside down. And see, that's where I believe a lot of preachers get this whole thing all wrong, because they forget that they are not there to be served. It's their job to serve. But the problem is that it's not just the preacher who's there to be served. You as church members are not here to be served. You're not here so God will serve you. One of the things that I loved about the analogy of the Cohen, they had to be gracious knowing that they get no reward. See, again, when the Levites were not given land, they had to serve without a reward. God says, I am your reward.
That's right.
Everybody else could see their reward, Danny. The Cohens had to believe in their reward. They had to have faith in their reward. So again, it goes back to that thing, is that when we first started, it says, do not grow weary in doing the right thing. Because if you, every time, Carrie, you did the right thing, you were rewarded for it, that's not graciousness. That's not being kind.
No.
That's getting paid. It says that if you do something on earth and expecting your reward on earth, it says you'll get it.
You'll get it. You can have it.
But if you do something on earth and not expect your reward, he says not only will he give it to you in heaven, but he will give it to you on earth as well.
Yeah.
But see, it's about that attitude. It's about knowing that you're a royal priesthood. You represent God. But the alternative to this is, a lady asked me, she says, Monty, she says, I don't understand how you know to do this stuff. She says, you told me you've never done this window like this before. I've never figured. I've never built a window door like I had to build last week. Never done it before. She says, how do you know how to do this thing if you don't know how to do it? I said, well, I've got this little theory that I live by. My theory is this. I don't have to know how to do something if I know how to not do something.
How to fix it.
If I know and can figure out how not to do this thing, then all I got to do is exact opposite.